welcome, breathe slowly. Let the air settle in your chest, and then let it drift away again, unhurried, as though it too is a traveler crossing an endless expanse. And as you listen now, I invite you to imagine yourself standing at the threshold of the Gobi Desert, a place where the winds never truly rest and the sands shift and sigh like time itself, where every grain seems to carry memory, where silence and sound are not opposites, but companions. For in this vastness, quiet does not mean absence, but rather the presence of something deeper, something older. And in the rhythm of your breath, you can begin to feel that slowness, the pace of a land that has witnessed ages pass without haste. For the desert does not hurry, the camel does not hurry, and tonight neither do we. And as you let the words unfold, you may notice the landscape forming around you, an atmosphere woven from distance and stillness and the subtle weight of endurance. And the Gobi itself stretches before your mind's eye like an ocean without water, its horizons dissolving into pale ochres that glow beneath the midday sun, shifting into soft silvers when dawn spills over the edges of the earth, and later into indigos so deep at night that they seem almost liquid. And there, in that palette of the sky and the sand, you feel the extremes, the unrelenting heat that presses down at noon until the very rocks seem to shimmer with fatigue, and then the sudden collapse into coldness once the sun has set. A cold that bites through layers of cloth, that whispers against the skin with sharpness like crystal, as though the air itself had turned into glass. And in between these hours, between scorching and freezing, lies the fragile thread of life that men and camels together must hold. And perhaps you hear it now, the groan of camels rising like low music from deep within their chests, heavy, ancient, rhythmic, like the pulse of the desert itself. And alongside that sound, the soft crunch of footsteps pressed into gravel, the muffled rustle of fabric as cloaks shift against the wind, and somewhere beyond the horizon the faint call of the wind itself as it gathers and moves, sculpting dunes, reshaping the land. And all of this creates not chaos, but a pattern, an order of slowness, the same slowness you are invited to rest into now. For the desert is both harsh and comforting, unforgiving, yet strangely steady, demanding, yet predictable in its unpredictability. And this is the stage, the silent theater, upon which the lives of countless camel tenders have unfolded, not celebrated, not remembered in statues or chronicles, yet essential in ways more profound than most realize. For, unlike the soldiers who carried swords, unlike the emperors whose names were carved into stone, unlike the poets whose verses were copied and carried across generations, the camel tender was a figure of obscurity, nameless in history, faceless in record, yet without his steady hands, an unrelenting patience. The grand designs of trade and empire would have dissolved like mirages, because it was he who kept the caravans moving, he who mended the saddles with fingers stiff from cold or swollen from heat, he who guarded beasts and burdens against thieves and storms, he who woke before dawn to lead groaning animals toward oases only half remembered, and he who collapsed at night upon coarse blankets with sand in his teeth and wind in his bones, yet rose again at the first pale light because the road was longer than any dream. And here, as you listen, you can feel the quiet dignity of that unseen labor, the way that obscurity itself becomes a kind of sanctity, because the world only moves when unseen shoulders carry it forward. And the Silk Road, which connected east to west, which carried silk and spices, paper and porcelain, knowledge and faith, could not have existed without those forgotten hands. And so tonight we honor them not with noise, but with slowness, with stillness, with gentle remembrance. And in this remembering we mirror the very rhythm of the desert, patient, repetitive, constant. Because the desert does not hurry, the camel does not hurry, and tonight neither do we. And as these words linger, you may begin to sense how hardship itself can take on beauty when it is carried with rhythm. How even obscurity can shine quietly like starlight over dunes, unseen yet constant. And so the introduction to this journey is not an invitation to excitement, but to stillness, not to spectacle, but to simplicity, not to the triumph of emperors, but to the footsteps of tenders who kept their animals alive in landscapes that wanted everything to perish. And so, as you breathe again, slowly, imagine yourself now stepping into their path, the path of endurance, the path of slowness, and let the desert carry you as the words unfold. The body in the desert is not a body as you once knew it, not the body of leisure or of comfort, not the body that belonged to the cool shade of trees or the softness of beds, but a body rewritten by the endless expanse of sand and stone, by the winds that never stop pressing, by the sun that sears without pity, and by the cold that slices through marrow when the stars rise, and it begins each day in a silence heavier than dreams. As cold mornings greet the tender not with dew or birdsong, but with numb fingers that can barely bend, fingers stiff as twigs caught in frost, trying with stubborn patience to mend saddles whose leather has cracked, whose seams fray under the strain of weight. And journey, and the task is clumsy at first, needle slipping, thread refusing to pass, skin protesting at the stiffness, yet slowly, inevitably, the hands remember, because the hands must remember, and so even in numbness the work continues, for in the desert nothing waits, nothing pauses, and the camel will not carry its burden without the steady grip of straps and ropes, and so the body bends forward, breath fogging faintly in the brittle morning air, shoulders hunched not just against the cold, but against the fatigue of repetition. And as the light grows, the desert begins its transformation, frost yielding to heat, and the same skin that was stiff and bluish with cold begins to swell under the sun, lips cracking, splitting into red seams, every fold of flesh gathering dust, until even the lines of the face, the crooks of the elbow, the creases behind the knee, are filled with grit, and the body itself becomes another vessel of sand, as though the desert has begun to remake the human in its own dry image, and calluses bloom thick across the palms, rough as bark, evidence of ropes pulled, knots tied, tools gripped too long and too hard, evidence also of survival, because in the desert the soft body cannot endure. Only the hardened one does, only the body, willing to transform itself into something between flesh and stone. And so calluses and cracked lips are not signs of weakness, but of adaptation, though the price is high, for each rope leaves its mark, biting into shoulders, bruises blossoming where straps dig against bone, and every day is a layering of pain. Muscles stiff from endless walking, tendons burning, knees swollen, back hunched, and the ache does not ease with rest, because the desert does not grant rest. The desert only grants more steps, and so the body moves forward in rhythm. Step, drag, breathe, step, drag, breathe, shallow and dry. breath becoming not an unconscious act, but a constant companion, always present, always noticed, rasping against the throat, tasting of dust and wind, never full, never satisfying, and yet it sustains. It sustains because it must. And in that rhythm there is a strange kind of poetry, a chant of survival, for as the legs move, dragging through gravel and dune, as the chest rises and falls in dry cadence, the words repeat themselves in silence. Step, drag, breathe, step, drag, breathe, and the body obeys, and the body learns that it is not separate from this land, but bound to it, reshaped by it, made coarse and weathered like the very ropes it handles, like the very wood of the saddles it repairs. And still, despite the harshness, there is endurance. There is the slow discovery that survival itself is a form of companionship, that the bruises and cracks and calluses are a kind of dialogue between human and desert, between effort and necessity, and though obscurity remains, though no one will remember the aches or the shallow breaths, still the body carries, still the body steps, still the body breathes, because this is the only way to cross the desert. This is the only way the Silk Road can live. And so the mantra continues, softer now, quieter, woven into the silence itself. Step, drag, breathe, step, drag, breathe, until it feels less like exhaustion and more like prayer, less like suffering and more like rhythm. And in that rhythm, though the body is marked and scarred, though the flesh is cracked and strained, the desert does not conquer it. The desert instead accepts it, shapes it, folds it into its vastness, so that by the time the stars rise again and the night grows sharp and merciless, the tender is no longer separate from the land, but part of it, moving through it not as stranger, but as one more thread in the ancient weave of endurance. Daily tasks and tools, the quiet litany of a life bound to necessity, unfold in the desert not as a list of chores, but as the pulse of survival itself, because in this endless horizon of shifting sand and biting wind, where distances cannot be measured by sight, but only by the aching weight of the journey, the camel tender does not simply wake into another day, but wakes into obligation, into the steady companionship of objects that demand care as insistently as living beings. And so, the first task, often begun when the sky is pale with dawn's cold light, is to check the saddles, patched and repatched with scraps of leather, scavenged from older gear, tightened again and again with coarse rope that frays under the strain. Because a saddle is more than wood and hide. It is the fragile hinge upon which the caravan turns, the frame that balances silk and spice, jade and wool, incense and knowledge, the cargo that empires desire but cannot carry themselves. And so each morning the tender bends low, fingers probing the seams for weakness, eyes scanning for cracks, ears alert for the subtle groan of wood stretched too far, because one slip, one tear, one buckle left unattended could mean a load sliding in the middle of a dune. A camel spooked, a pack tumbled into the dust, and with it perhaps the wealth of a city lost. So the tender mends with patience, with a rhythm of piercing and knotting, threading and binding, until the patchwork saddle resembles a map of its own endurance, scarred, rugged, yet serviceable, a silent partner in the endless journey. And when that task is done, the attention turns to waterskins, those swollen, heavy pouches of animal hide, darkened with use, damp with faint seepage. And they are not mere containers, but lifelines, each one a fragile reservoir between breath and silence, between endurance and death. And so they are checked obsessively, seams pressed, caps sealed, cords tightened, because a slow leak, invisible at first, could spell disaster hours or days later, when thirst sharpens into torment. And the desert offers no forgiveness, no hidden springs, only the cruel certainty of emptiness. And so the tender guards them like treasure, shifting them carefully on the packs, balancing their weight so no animal strains unevenly, lifting each as though it were a child cradled in weary arms. And after the saddles and the skins comes the endless grinding attention to harnesses, to the ropes and straps that tie the caravan together. Strands that chafe against fir knots that slip if left unchecked, leather stiffened by sun and cracked by cold. All of it demanding constant oiling, smoothing, adjusting, for the desert devours what it touches. Leather turned brittle, fibers turned to dust, and the tender knows this law, knows that vigilance is the only answer, because to ignore even one buckle, one strap, is to invite the slow unraveling of the caravan's fragile order. And so with oil-stained hands the harnesses are rubbed, the knots tightened, the packs shifted again and again, until they rest firm, until the weight is shared evenly across each beast, because in the desert even the smallest imbalance grows into catastrophe, a rubbed sore becoming a wound, a slipping rope becoming a fall. And all the while the tender's eyes are never still, watching, adjusting, listening to the small groans of wood, the creak of rope, the shifting breath of camels as they bear their burdens. For constant vigilance is not a choice, but the very condition of survival. And so the body bends, the hands work, the mind tallies and checks, every detail attended to, with a devotion born not of pride, but of necessity, because one broken strap could cost not only a day, but an entire journey, not only the goods, but the lives bound together by them. And in this endless labor there is a strange companionship, for the tools themselves become like kin. Saddles patched so many times, they bear the memory of every journey. Ropes stiffened with the sweat of years. Waterskins softened by the press of countless hands. Each object carrying its own story of endurance. Each one an extension of the tender's body, of the camel's strength, of the caravan's fragile, stubborn determination to move forward. And so the daily tasks, repetitive and unglamorous, are not mere chores, but rituals, acts of quiet devotion that bind human, animal, and object together in one unbroken thread of survival stretched across the desert's vast, indifferent face. And the tender knows, though no one else may ever notice, that it is these tools, these tasks, these small, tireless attentions that hold the Silk Road itself together. That without them, silk would never reach the West, spices would never perfume distant markets, words and ideas would never leap between cultures, and empires themselves would remain silent, cut off from each other. Because in the end it is not emperors or generals who hold the world's roads, but the unseen hands of those who patch saddles, guard waterskins, oil harnesses, adjust packs, and walk endlessly forward, step by step, rope by rope, knot by knot, vigilance without rest, endurance without glory, the quiet work upon which all else depends. Companionship with camels is unlike companionship with any other creature, for they are neither pets nor tools, neither submissive servants nor equal partners, but something in between, a stubborn, breathing paradox of desert survival, and to live among them is to live with constant negotiation. Because camels are dependable in the way a river is dependable. They flow, they carry, they sustain, but they also resist, flood, refuse, and groan. And the camel tender learns not to command but to adapt, not to demand but to endure. For these animals, often called ships of the desert, are indeed like ships, but slow ships, groaning ships, complaining ships, carrying the weight of silks and spices, grain and jade, incense and salt, while filling the air with a chorus of protest. Every groan and snort and guttural sigh, a reminder that the partnership between man and beast is forged not of affection, but of necessity. And yet, in that necessity, something like respect grows, grudging, unspoken, but real. Because in the desert, where the sun scalds by day and the cold cuts by night, where the horizon stretches into eternity, and the sands shift like restless spirits, the camel is not simply an animal, but a lifeline, and its every sound, from the deep rumble in its throat to the sharp huff of breath through its flared nostrils, is like a conversation, a language the tender learns without grammar, but through patience, through listening, through living beside them for endless days and nights. And the sounds themselves become part of the desert's atmosphere. The groan of a camel settling into its knees at dusk, echoing like the creak of wood on a ship at anchor. The slow, vibrating sigh of a beast rising under weight in the pale light of dawn. Carrying the weariness of centuries, the short, irritated snort at an unbalanced load, becoming a kind of warning, a pulse of displeasure that the tender must heed. And so the desert is never truly silent, not while camels walk it, for their voices, low and strange, merge with the wind and the shifting grains of sand, and the tender comes to hear them not as noise, but as music. Harsh, perhaps, discordant, but music nonetheless, the sound of survival. And in time, the relationship between man and camel grows into one of mutual awareness, the animals sensing the moods of their tenders, responding not to words, but to tones, to silences, to gestures, so that a weary man makes for a weary caravan, while steady patience steadies even the most temperamental beast. And so the tender, though often irritated, learns a kind of humility, learns to soften anger, learns to match his own breath to the rhythm of the animals, because to lose patience is to invite chaos, a beast refusing to rise, refusing to walk, collapsing its great body into the sand with the weight of a boulder, unmovable, unpersuaded by whip or shout, responding only when respect, persistence, and rhythm coax it into motion once again. And so a grudging respect takes root, built not on tenderness, but on endurance, not on affection, but on trust, the kind of trust forged in heat and dust, in long marches and shared hardship. Because in truth, the camel tender depends on the animal as much as the animal depends on him. And though the camel may not know gratitude in any human sense, it knows consistency. It knows the steady hands that lift loads, that adjust straps, that guard water, and it responds with its own form of consistency, by carrying, by bearing, by bending, by enduring, day after day, mile after mile, across the cruel immensity of the Gobi. And perhaps this is why the old phrase lingers, ships of the desert, because like ships, camels do not sail willingly, but they sail, they move, they carry, they link distant worlds. And just as sailors learn to read the groans of timbers and the sighs of sails, so too do camel tenders learn to read the voices of their beasts, to sense the fatigue in their pace, the irritation in their snorts, the subtle complaint in their groans, and in this constant exchange of signals, in this dialogue without words, companionship takes root, not tender and affectionate, but real, undeniable, forged of hardship. And so the tender comes to see in these creatures something almost human in their resistance, almost divine in their endurance. And the repetition rises in the mind like a mantra whispered into the desert wind. They bear, they bend, they endure, they bear. They bend, they endure, a refrain that matches the rhythm of footsteps, the sway of loads, the long procession across emptiness, and in repeating it, in listening to the camel's stubborn voice, the tender learns something about himself, about endurance without praise, about labor without rest, about survival without glory. And though no one may ever sing of these animals, though emperors will never carve their likenesses into stone, the tender knows, in the marrow of his body, that without them the desert would remain unbroken, the Silk Road an impossible dream, and the world itself far smaller, far poorer than the groaning, sighing, stubborn, indispensable ships of the desert have allowed it to be. Dangers of the road were the silent companions of every caravan, never named aloud too often for fear of summoning them, yet never absent from thought, because the desert is not simply a void of sand and silence. It is a living stage of uncertainty where every horizon might hide peril. Every ridge might conceal eyes watching, and every nightfall might bring a chill so deep that even the strongest beasts and most hardened men tremble. And so when we speak of travel across the Gobi, we speak not merely of endurance, but of constant vigilance, of existing always in the fragile space between survival and collapse. Because the dangers were not singular, but layered, one upon another, bandits, storms, and cold weaving together into a tapestry of quiet menace, a fabric of fear stitched into every journey. And yet the caravan still moved, step by slow step, dragging itself across emptiness, carrying the lifeblood of the Silk Road. And so let us look carefully, slowly at these dangers, at what it meant to live beneath their shadow. Bandits were the first and most obvious threat, for where there are goods, there will always be those who wish to take them. And caravans laden with silk, jade, spices, grain, and precious stones were moving treasuries, tempting not only to wandering thieves, but to organized raiding bands, men who knew the landscape, who could appear suddenly like shadows drawn up from the sand itself, perched on ridgelines, their silhouettes sharp against the burning sky, their patience long, their strikes sudden, and the tender, trudging beside his animals, could never truly forget them. For even when the horizon seemed empty, the thought of eyes watching from afar remained silent, piercing, and though most nights passed uneventfully, the tension was always there, lingering like a low ache, because one clash, one moment of ambush, could scatter the animals, topple the loads, and send lives unraveling in a storm of violence. And so guards were posted, firelight was ringed carefully, and weapons, however crude, however few, were kept within reach, for the knowledge of danger was itself a kind of weapon, a constant reminder not to grow careless, not to let fatigue blind vigilance. But bandits were only one shadow among many, for the desert itself was the greatest thief of all, and its weapon was the sandstorm, sudden, merciless, walls of dust and wind that rose without warning, swallowing the horizon in a churning blindness, turning noon into midnight, the air itself into suffocation. And when the storm came, there was no fighting it, no pushing forward, only clinging to life, pulling fabric across the face, clutching rope to rope, man to camel, camel to load, praying the line did not break. Because in a storm there is no direction, no sound, but the roar of sand striking flesh, striking fabric, striking skin raw, and a man who let go might vanish forever, buried in a moving sea that cared nothing for his name, his struggle, or his place in the world. And so the tender knew to dread these storms, to sense their approach in the thickening air, in the strange stillness that sometimes fell before them. And yet no knowledge could truly shield him, only the humility to stop, to endure, to let the storm pass. And even then, when the dust finally thinned, when the world re-emerged, pale and stripped the damage, was always there, the throat scraped raw, the lips cracked deeper, the animals coughing their strange low coughs, the loads coated in grit that would never be entirely shaken off, the skin rubbed raw in places that would burn for days, and the endless sand shifting beneath their feet as though the world itself had been rearranged while they hid. And then there was the cold, that third danger, as merciless as the first two, for if the sun scorched by day, the night cut with knives of ice, and the desert became a place of paradox, where the same air that could blister the skin now froze the marrow, and men and beasts alike huddled close, drawing warmth from shared bodies, from firelight that flickered like fragile hope, against the immensity of dark, and the winds howled across the open spaces, howled like voices, sometimes so eerily like voices that a man half asleep might think he heard whispers, might imagine the dead calling, might see in the dancing firelight shapes that were not there. And so the cold was not only a physical assault, but a test of spirit, for it gnawed at resolve, it seeped into bones, and without constant tending of fire, without constant movement of blood, it could claim a man as silently as any knife or storm. And so each ember, each log, each guarded flame was precious, and every man took his turn keeping watch, not only for raiders, but for the fire itself, for letting it die was letting despair creep in, and despair in the desert is as deadly as any blade. So it was that fear lived always with the caravan, not loud, not consuming, but quiet, tucked into the corner of every night, sometimes ignored, sometimes felt more keenly, but always there, and the tender learned to live with it, as one lives, with thirst, with dust, with aching feet, a companion unwelcome, yet inseparable. And perhaps this too is part of the lesson of the Silk Road, that every treasure it carried was tempered by danger, that every step of silk from east to west was shadowed by hardship, that the unseen backbone of trade was not the glittering court or the celebrated merchant, but the quiet endurance of men who walked beside camels through fear, through storm, through silence, and survived. There were, amidst the grinding weight of dust and the endless repetition of step, drag, breathe, moments that gleamed like hidden jewels, small respites in the desert's severity, tiny mercies that did not erase the hardship but softened it, that did not undo the labor but reminded the caravan tenders why life, even here, even in this wilderness of wind and stone and thirst, still contained beauty. And so when we speak of relief, we do not imagine luxuries, for luxuries did not belong here, but small gestures, shared glances, breaths of reprieve that allowed the heart to unfurl for a time. And perhaps the first among these was the sharing of a flask of tea brewed not in abundance, but in scarcity, leaves carried carefully across distance, boiled in water too precious to waste, poured into cracked cups or tin bowls, passed hand to hand, the steam rising like incense into the cool desert air, carrying with it not merely warmth, but memory of home, of hearth, of kitchens where water was plentiful and fire was steady. And so each sip became more than liquid. It became solace, and the act of sharing itself bound men together. For in the desert, survival was not the triumph of the solitary, but the covenant of the group. And in the quiet, when the flames of a small fire licked upward, when men sat shoulder to shoulder, with sand still clinging to their clothes and salt still streaking their skin, the taste of that tea was not just refreshment, but communion, a reminder that they were not alone in their burden. And from that bond came strength to endure the next day. And if tea was the drink of the evening, then song was the language of the night. For under the vast stars, when the sky unfolded in endless black peppered with sparks of cold fire, voices would sometimes rise low, at first almost hesitant and then fuller, weaving together in melody that was less performance than prayer, less entertainment than release songs, murmured as though they belonged to the wind itself, carrying tales of faraway villages, of mothers and wives, of rivers and mountains unseen for months, of faith in gods who listened even from these barren places. And sometimes the camels themselves would lift their heads as though listening, snorting softly in the rhythm, sighing deeply in their strange guttural tones, and the music stitched human fragility into the immensity of the night, so that men felt, if only briefly, less swallowed by the void, less scattered by the silence, more tethered to something beyond themselves. And when the song ended, there was always a pause, a sacred pause, where no one rushed to speak, as though to let the echo linger a little longer before the wind carried it away. And in that pause, relief lingered, subtle but real. And then there was the relief that came not from men but from beasts, from the camels who bore the burden, without complaint, though they groaned and grumbled as if to remind their tenders of the weight they carried. And when, at the end of a long day, after miles of trudging across shifting sand and jagged stone, the camels at last knelt, folding their legs beneath them, with a heavy sigh sinking down into rest, the tenders felt a wave of gratitude almost like reverence, because that kneeling was not merely habit but cooperation, obedience offered after long labor, a gesture that said, "Here, now we stop, we breathe, we rest." And so the men too felt permitted to set down their loads, to ease their shoulders, to let the stiffness melt from their limbs. And there was joy in that rhythm, in the partnership of man and beast, the recognition that though the caravan moved as a unit, rest was as essential as movement. And each kneeling animal was like a bell tolling the hour of relief, the end of toil, for now a sigh echoing into the stillness. Yet perhaps the greatest relief, the truest gift of the desert, was the oasis, rare, precious, often no more than a cluster of palms gathered around a pool, or even just damp earth that meant water could be drawn. And yet, to those who traveled across thirst, an oasis was nothing less than miracle. And when the cry went up that water was near, every step quickened, every face lifted, the camels snorted with sudden life, and men felt the drag of fatigue loosen for the sight of green, of shade, of reflection, however small, struck the heart with joy deeper than words. And when at last they reached it, when lips touched cool water, when hands splashed faces, when beasts drank greedily and lowered their heads in contentment, the oasis became a sanctuary, fleeting perhaps, yet unforgettable, and the memory of it lingered long after they left, carried in the skin of water, strapped to the saddle, carried in the thought that such places still existed in the desert, proof that even here, in the most inhospitable of landscapes, life found a way to gather, to persist, to nurture. And so these moments shared in scarcity songs sung to the stars, camels kneeling in rest, oases found like secrets, were the threads of mercy in a fabric woven mostly of hardship, and without them the cloth might have unraveled. But with them it held together, reminding each traveler that the desert, though harsh, was not without its softness, and life, though difficult, was not without its gifts, and in the quiet rhythm of such reliefs endurance found its anchor, and men kept walking. And so, as the fire of this first journey dwindles, and the sands of our meditation settle, let us linger upon the image of the camel tender, for his life, though unseen, uncelebrated, and often forgotten by the chronicles of kings and merchants, is nevertheless the quiet spine of the desert's commerce, the humble current beneath the great river of trade, the silent pulse that kept caravans moving when all else might have faltered. And in dwelling on his burdens, we see not merely his body, but his spirit, etched into sand and silence, carved into the very winds that scoured his skin, marked upon the cracked leather of his waterskins and the calloused pans of his palms. And it is in this etching that we discover the truth of endurance. For the camel tender's endurance was not the dramatic valor of a soldier who charges with sword in hand, nor the celebrated brilliance of a statesman whose words shape empires, but the endurance of repetition, of patience, of anonymous labor, each step made in dust, each breath drawn in thirst, each load lifted with muscles stiff from yesterday's burdens. And though history may pass over such men, leaving their names unrecorded, their stories unsung, still it is they who kept the desert alive with movement, they who ensured that silk reached the west and glass reached the east, they who bore upon their tired backs not only goods but entire worlds of exchange, cultures carried in silence across desolation. To meditate upon their lives is to meditate upon the unseen foundation of history, to realize that the great movements of civilization are not only built by the celebrated, but also by the anonymous, not only by those whose likenesses are carved into marble, but by those whose faces were hidden beneath veils of dust, whose songs were swallowed by wind, whose bones, when they returned to the earth, left no marker save the memory of their comrades. And yet, in that anonymity, there lies a certain purity, a certain kind of nobility, born not from applause, but from necessity, not from honor bestowed by courts, but from the simple fact that without their persistence, the wheels of trade and empire would grind to a halt. And as we sit with that thought, as we breathe it slowly, we begin to sense the paradox of their existence, invisible to the world, yet indispensable to it, voiceless in the scrolls of history, yet loud in the silence of the desert. The bruises from rope, the endless drag of weight, these were not romantic, not heroic in the way that tales often demand, but they were real. And in their reality lies the deepest meditation. For what is more profoundly human than the daily bearing of burdens, the quiet acceptance of hardship, whose companions were groaning camels and whispering winds, remind us that greatness often moves in silence, and that survival itself is a form of triumph. Wheeling overhead, we can almost feel the humility of their existence settling into our own, breathing, teaching us slowness, teaching us patience, teaching us endurance without applause. They were not remembered, yet they carried memory itself from city to city, from one edge of the world to another. Their story, though quiet, becomes a mirror, reminding us of all the invisible labor that sustains life, reminding us that behind every emperor, every merchant, every explorer, there are the unspoken lives of those who bore the burden. And so, as we leave their quiet burdens behind, as we step gently away from the sand and the wind, we turn our gaze toward another traveler, one whose life was not hidden in obscurity, but instead recorded, celebrated, and mythologized, a man who carried deserts and cities together in his tale, and whose footsteps traced not only the sands of Asia, but the pages of history itself. His name was Marco Polo. Then let us step into Marco Polo's journey beyond Venice, into the harsh crucible of the Silk Road, where deserts stretch wider than memory and mountains rise sharper than thought, where every horizon is both a promise and a warning, and every step is an act of endurance, an act of faith, an act of surrender. For though we often imagine Marco Polo as the grand traveler who recorded wonders in faraway courts, we forget that before he ever reached the magnificence of Kublai Khan's palace, he had to cross the landscapes that humbled kings and broke armies, the landscapes that camel tenders knew in their bones, the desert that tests the lips, the mountain that tests the lungs. And it is in these crossings, not in the jeweled halls, that the transformation began, because the desert strips away and the mountain lifts up only those who endure. So imagine, slowly, gently, Marco Polo leaving the green edges of familiar Europe and stepping into the vastness of the unknown. The caravan stretched long across dunes like a necklace of ants moving over golden skin. The sky immense, without mercy, the wind dry and endless, carrying the hiss of sand against leather, against cloth, against skin, so that the body becomes dusted, salted, stiff, every breath taken with effort, every swallow reminding him of water's scarcity. The waterskins guarded like treasure, each drop weighed against life itself. For in the desert nothing is wasted, nothing is casual. And the boy of Venice, who once knew cool canals, now knows thirst as a constant companion, a shadow on the tongue, a voice in the throat, whispering always, drink less, endure more. And still the sand goes on, rolling dune after dune, until the horizon itself feels like a line that can never be reached, only moved further away. And the sun overhead beats like a drum, relentless, flattening thought, until movement becomes mechanical. A mantra not of ambition, but of survival. Step, drag, breathe, step, drag, breathe, until the rhythm of the desert rewrites the rhythm of the body. And time itself becomes not a series of hours, but a series of trudges, each measured in grains of sand clinging to lashes, each measured in the dry crackle of lips, and in the silence of that desert, where sound seems swallowed before it begins. Marco Polo learns what the camel tenders already knew, that survival is not noise but patience, not glory but quiet endurance. And when night comes, when the desert cools suddenly into cold that cuts through fabric and bone, then stars burn harder than any lantern in Venice, so close, so sharp, so infinite that they seem almost to slice the sky open. And he shivers, pulling his cloak tighter, listening to camels groan and tenders murmur, and realizes that the desert is not empty at all, but full of unseen life, full of presence, full of trials that shape the heart as surely as they scrape the skin. And so he passes on, and the desert becomes mountain, for the Silk Road is not one landscape, but many, and the mountains rise like walls of stone and ice, cold teeth against the horizon. And Marco Polo must climb, step by step, lungs burning in thin air, ears ringing with silence, broken only by the crunch of snow, the echo of rockfall, the whistle of wind that cuts sharper than sand ever could. And here again the mantra returns: step, climb, breathe, step, climb, breathe. As paths narrow to ledges no wider than a body, as avalanches threaten without warning, as the cold stiffens fingers that once tugged sails in Venetian harbors, and still he climbs. Eyes stung with light reflecting off snow, skin burned not with sun now but with cold, cracked in a different way. Lips blue not from dryness but from frost, and still he moves, because the mountain, like the desert, does not care who you are, Venetian or tender, prince or peasant. It offers the same test: endure or perish. And in these moments Marco Polo is no more and no less than the men beside him, sharing meager rations, huddling close against the howl of the night winds, breathing shallow in air that never feels enough, but looking up at stars so sharp they seem to pierce the soul. And he feels small and vast at once, humbled and lifted. And he knows, even without words, that these trials are remaking him, stripping away the boy who left Venice and shaping a traveler who can hold deserts and mountains inside his memory, who can cross thresholds of endurance and still walk forward. And this is the true beginning of his journey, not in the writing of wonders, not in the courts of khans, but here, where the desert taught him thirst and patience, and the mountain taught him cold and perseverance. And together they taught him humility, the kind of humility that sees glory, not in gold, but in survival, not in conquest, but in the simple miracle of reaching the other side. And so we linger with him in this passage, breathing with him, moving with him, repeating with him the only truth the road allows. Step, climb, breathe, step, climb, breathe, until the body and spirit become one rhythm, until the boy becomes the traveler, until Marco Polo becomes the man who can carry deserts and mountains inside his voice forever. Then let us slow our gaze, letting the image of Marco Polo lengthen into the silence of the road, into the long breath of Earth's harshest landscapes. For before he ever entered the halls of Mongol khans, before he heard the polyglot voices of Silk Road markets, before he was dazzled by jeweled palaces and curious inventions, he had to walk through spaces that cared nothing for his youth or his Venetian name, the spaces of dust and stone, sand and snow, desert and mountains, where the world seemed not created for human life but against it, and yet those who crossed it became transformed, stripped bare, remade by endurance. Imagine first the desert, that endless reach of the Gobi, a sea of dust and shifting dunes, where the horizon drifts like a mirage, always retreating as you approach, where the sun presses down like a hand intent on smothering, where the wind stings the eyes, fills the ears with a constant hiss, and drives sand into every crease of fabric, into every fold of skin, until man and beast alike seem powdered with gold that burns rather than blesses. Here, the boy who once drifted in gondolas across cool Venetian canals tastes the true weight of thirst, feels his tongue turn leather, his lips crack until they bleed salt onto salt, and each swallow is rationed, counted, guarded. For the waterskin is more precious than coin, more vital than memory, and around him the caravan moves as one, a slow, deliberate line across the dunes, camels groaning, tenders murmuring, each step small but relentless, each hour the same as the one before. until time itself feels like it has been reduced to a rhythm. Step, drag, breathe, step, drag, breathe, until the mantra becomes survival, until the self becomes nothing but motion. And yet, in this monotony lies initiation, for the desert is both enemy and teacher, stripping away the distractions of life and leaving only the core truth: endure or perish. And when night falls, as suddenly as a curtain pulled across the stage, the furnace of day gives way to cold that bites the skin raw, stars sharp as knives hanging in an immense black vault, the silence so profound that even whispers feel intrusive. And Marco huddles close to his companions, wrapped in wool and leather, hearing camels sigh like tired ships, knowing that beyond their small circle of firelight is nothing but dark and chill, an emptiness that could swallow them whole. And yet he finds a strange comfort there, in the murmured songs, in the brief sharing of dried fruit or bitter tea, in the companionship born of shared suffering. So the desert passes, and in its passing leaves him thinned, hardened, altered, and soon the mountains rise. The Pamirs, the roof of the world, teeth of stone and ice piercing the horizon, their peaks wrapped in white that blinds the eyes with reflected light, their passes narrow and treacherous, their air so thin that every breath feels borrowed, so that again the mantra returns: step, climb, breathe, step, climb, breathe, lungs burning, chest tightening, ears ringing with the high silence of altitude, fingers numbed until the reins slip and must be clenched again, nights colder than any Venetian winter, when frost forms inside the beard, when breath curls like smoke and never seems enough, when hunger deepens into weakness, and weakness into a slow, dangerous sleep. And it is here that Marco knows another kind of trial. Not of thirst now, but of air, not of burning, but of freezing. For snow and ice replace sand and heat, yet the lesson is the same: endure or perish, climb or be buried, breathe or be lost. Avalanches rumble like distant drums, rockfalls scatter like the wrath of giants. Paths cling to cliffs so narrow that one misstep could cast a man into endless depths. And still they climb, still they walk, because there is no turning back, only forward, only step, climb, breathe. Here camaraderie deepens, for no man can face the mountain alone. They share warmth, share rations, share silence, eyes meeting with the unspoken acknowledgement that survival belongs to the group, never the solitary. And Marco, the boy of Venice, feels himself bound to these men of deserts and steppes by hardship stronger than blood, hardship that erases borders, languages, names. And above all this, the stars blaze, not the gentle shimmer of stars reflected in canals, but the fierce, cold fire of creation itself, dazzling and indifferent, pressing down on the climbers as if to remind them of their smallness, their fragility, and yet also their place in a universe vast beyond comprehension. And Marco, shivering in furs, coughing against the thin air, feels within himself the birth of a traveler's soul, one who understands that the world is not tamed by ships or maps, but survived step by step, endured breath by breath. And so the mountains, like the desert, pass, though never completely, for they carve themselves into memory. They etch their lessons into bone and spirit, and when he descends into the steppes beyond, into lands where the Mongol world will begin to unfold before him, he carries within him the silence of the Gobi, the sharp stars of the Pamirs, the rhythm of endurance that will guide him through all that follows. For these crossings were more than landscapes. They were thresholds, initiations, trials that unmade the boy and remade the man. And this is the truth of Marco Polo's beginning, that before he became a teller of wonders, he became a survivor of Earth's harshest tests, one who had walked through deserts that parched the tongue and mountains that squeezed the lungs, and who had learned the oldest mantra of travelers: step, climb, breathe, step, climb, breathe, the words of endurance, the prayer of survival, the rhythm of a life remade by hardship. Then let us imagine the descent from the high passes, the gradual softening of the earth beneath the feet, snow loosening into stone, giving way to dust, and dust at last pressed into paths that carry more than silence, for here, on the threshold of the Mongol world, Marco Polo enters places where voices outnumber winds, where the air no longer belongs only to the hiss of sand or the howl of mountain storms, but to the mingled cries of languages and the bustle of trade. And so the boy who has endured the emptiness of desert and the trial of icy summits suddenly finds himself immersed in caravanserais that are themselves like miniature empires, vast square enclosures of mud brick or carved stone, strong gates opening to courtyards filled with beasts kneeling, packs being untied, water being drawn, and merchants greeting one another as brothers in hardship and rivals in profit, voices rising in Persian, Arabic, Mongolian, Turkic, Chinese, Armenian, Greek, all carried into the rafters like the mingling of rivers, and Marco ears still echoing with the silence of the Gobi. Now here's the flood of humanity as a music both overwhelming and intoxicating. Everywhere is color, banners fluttering red and gold, silk draped from stalls, bolts of fabric shimmering with dye drawn from crushed insects and rare stones, indigo deep as twilight, saffron bright as flame. And the touch of it is like water against his fingers, soft, smooth, almost liquid, so different from the rough wool and rope that had bound him through the desert. Spices to fill the senses, cinnamon sharp, cardamom sweet, pepper biting the tongue even before it is tasted. And he breathes them in with awe, each scent a promise of lands beyond, each jar a fragment of worlds stitched together by this road. And the fudo, after dried meat and the coarse bread of caravans, the taste of roasted lamb spiced with cumin, the steam of rice perfumed with saffron, the sticky sweetness of honeyed figs. Each bite feels like the body remembering abundance after deprivation, like life reasserting itself against the memory of endurance. And yet it is not only abundance that astonishes him, but order, for the Mongol world does not rule its vastness with chaos but with rhythm, with relay stations set at intervals like beads on a necklace, each one holding fresh horses, shelter, scribes who record messages, guards who ensure passage, so that a decree from the Khan may travel hundreds of miles in days, faster than any gondola could ever cut through Venetian canals. And Marco, whose lungs still ache from the mountains, sees now horses sleek and restless, couriers lean as arrows, the empire's breath moving through arteries of earth, banners, too, mark this frontier, not decorative but declarative, stiff silk squares dyed with clan symbols, horsehair streamers catching the wind, each one proclaiming presence, belonging, authority, so that even in towns crowded with Armenians and Persians, Chinese and Arabs, one sees the hand that binds them together, the Mongol hand, firm, unyielding, invisible, yet everywhere. And Marco, standing in the midst of it, feels the shift in his own spirit. For just as the silence of the wilderness had pared him down to endurance, so now the noise of these markets begins to fill him with curiosity, wonder, hunger, not only of the body, but of the mind. For he sees here not just goods, but knowledge being exchange maps sketched in the dust, remedies whispered over jars of dried herbs, tales of kingdoms to the east and south carried by men who have crossed lands he has yet to dream of. And in this mingling, in this abundance, the boy of Venice finds both a mirror and a contrast. For Emerus, too, is a city of traders, of ships heavy with spice and silk, of voices braided from many tongues, yet never had he seen it so vast, so deliberately woven, so protected by a hand that spanned deserts and mountains alike. And the thought rises within him, quiet as a seed, but certain, that the Mongol world is not merely a collection of lands, but a bridge itself, binding wilderness and city, east and west, silence and song. And when night comes, and the caravanserai gates are closed, and fires burn in 100 little braziers, and merchants recline on carpets while their camels rest outside, Marco looks at the sky above those same sharp stars that had once glared over the Pomerzand, feels how different they seem now, softened by laughter, by song, by the hum of lives lived in community, and he understands that he has crossed not only landscapes but thresholds of being, that he has stepped from the trial of endurance into the theater of abundance, and this too is a form of initiation. This too will shape the traveler he is becoming. 4 deserts test the body, mountains test the breath, but cities, these living marketplaces of the Mongol world, test the mind, the appetite for learning, the willingness to see that the world is vaster than any single shore, any single tongue, any single memory. And as he listens to the music of merchants bartering, to the hooves of relay horses striking stone, to the rustle of silk carried like water in the breeze, Marco Polo feels himself poised on the edge of a new world, a bridge between silence and abundance, hardship and wonder, a bridge that he will walk for the rest of his life, and through him centuries later, so will we. Then let us imagine Marco Polo's first steps into the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court, the long road from the caravanserai behind him, dust still clinging to his sandals, the chill of distant mountains lingering in his bones. And now before him stretches a realm that seems almost suspended between reality and dream. For the palace itself rises like a wave of ordered splendor upon the plain, a city within a city, its gates gilded, its walls stretching wide as rivers of stone, banners catching sunlight and fluttering like living brushstrokes across a canvas of sky, and silk tents ripple gently in the breeze, each one a color, a symbol, a subtle declaration of the Khan's reach. And Marco, small among the procession of courtiers, translators, and envoys, feels both diminished and elevated. For his eyes cannot help but wander from the mosaic of garden trees, planted with deliberate symmetry, flowers selected not only for color but for fragrance, water channels flowing softly, reflecting both sky and palace, fish glinting in slow arcs, as if they know the importance of quiet observation, to the inner halls where floors are polished to a reflective sheen, lanterns hung in measured rhythm, casting soft golden pools of light, the scent of incense, mingling with sandalwood the faint tang of lacquered wood. And here the power of the Khan manifests not in noise or force, but in order, in the precision of each servant's step, each attendant's bow, each scribe's movement across parchment. And Marco, in the role of observer, translator, and courier of messages, moves through this choreography with care, absorbing gestures and tone, recording each subtle hierarchy, each pause in speech, each nod that conveys favor or caution, for nothing is accidental, nothing ignored, and his mind, still tuned by weeks of deserts and mountains, finds a certain rhythm in the court, a slow cadence that echoes the repetition of his earlier journeys. He watched, he listened, he remembered, he watched, he listened, he remembered each phrase like a heartbeat, each moment a measure in a meditation. And yet Marco cannot help but marvel at the intimacy embedded in such grandeur. For within the vastness of halls, lined with tapestries depicting victories, hunts, and celestial symbols, there are also quiet corners where scholars confer, courtiers whisper observations, musicians tune instruments, their plucked strings vibrating a gentle hum through polished wood, and he senses that the empire, while immense, functions on these layers of subtle interactions, each one like a thread in a vast tapestry, delicate yet strong, colorful yet restrained, a balance of motion and stillness that mirrors the flow of rivers he crossed and the sands he traversed, and even as he witnesses ceremonies, gifts being presented, horses led with care, officials prostrating themselves before the Khan in ritualized gracie, notes the minor human gestures that reveal character, a child tugging at a mother's sleeve, a servant exchanging a quiet glance with a friend, a translator leaning slightly to catch a whispered clarification, moments almost invisible except to a patient eye, and Marco records them all in his mind, building a quiet ledger of human interaction that will later inform his narratives. Each observation layering detail upon detail, each memory folded into the tapestry of understanding, and in the gardens he lingers, watching how light filters through silk canopies onto marble floors, how water in fountains rises and falls with a whisper, how birds, unstartled by human presence, perch on carved balustrades, their feathers catching the sun. And he imagines that this court, so organized and resplendent, is itself a living organism, a pulse of movement and breath, a carefully managed ecosystem of power, respect, and ritual. And as he moves from courtyard to hall, each footstep assured, he notes the colors again, the deep blues of lacquered beams, reds of banners, gold leaf catching the angle of sun just so, silvers that glint like distant snow, and the repetition of patterns, arches, lattice, pillars, rugs gives him a sense of quiet meditation even amid opulence, for symmetry itself soothes, and he begins to understand that Kublai Khan's power radiates not from spectacle alone, but from the deliberate cultivation of observation, of notice, of awareness. And Marco, trained by deserts and mountains to endure, to watch, to learn, now applies that same discipline in service of comprehension, noting protocols, the angle of a bow, the sequence of steps, the ceremonial placement of gifts, the pacing of speech, all in a mind that must retain both detail and context, for he may be called to convey messages, advise on exchanges, or simply act as a steady observer whose impressions shape understanding across continents. And yet he is also human, and even as he carries this responsibility, he allows himself to feel awe, tempered by calm, the shimmer of silk in sunlight, the gentle ripple of water over stone, the quiet laughter between attendants, the disciplined flutter of a lantern, the scent of jasmine wafting through open doorways. Each sensory note recorded without haste, without judgment, simply presence, and in these quiet moments, he imagines the lives behind the ritual, the countless courtiers whose days are measured by protocol, whose knowledge and memory form the invisible backbone of the empire. And he notes that this awareness of rhythm and order resonates with what he learned crossing deserts, with the long, measured steps of camels, with the patient endurance of the tender who carries life across sands. For now, Marco sees the human continuity of labor and ceremony, of endurance and observation, threaded from humble caravan paths to the marble halls of emperors. And he allows the mind to drift along these connections as he moves through galleries, terraces, and chambers, listening to the low murmur of conversation, the soft padding of servants' sandals, the distant echo of horses in courtyard, and the subtle interplay of light and shadow over carved reliefs. And in each repeated glance, each careful measurement of space and gesture, he builds a meditative archive of wonder. He watched, he listened, he remembered. He watched, he listened, he remembered, a refrain that becomes mantra, a gentle reminder that observation itself can be a form of devotion, that the act of attention, of careful noting, of respectful presence, is a quiet form of service. And as the day fades and sunlight softens into dusk, casting long shadows across gardens, banners, and courtyards, Marco stands at a window or terrace and allows himself a slow, deep breath, tasting the incense on the air, feeling the warmth of the stones beneath his fingers, noticing the precise alignment of columns and lanterns, the play of wind through silk, the harmony of sound and movement. And he realizes that even in the most intricate ceremony, the smallest gestures, the tilt of a head, the pause in a bow, the hush of a footstep carry meaning, that beauty exists not only in wealth and scale, but in quiet attentiveness. And he carries this understanding inward, letting it settle like sand in an hourglass, a calm sediment of observation and meditation. And so the young Venetian, hardened by desert winds and mountain cold, begins his apprenticeship not only in trade, diplomacy, and travel, but in the slow, reflective mastery of presence itself, a skill as essential as any knowledge of language, geography, or commerce. For in the quiet noticing of gestures, in the patient recording of sequence, in the gentle layering of sensory detail, Marco Polo learns what no map or guide can teach: that the world is vast, that power is subtle, that endurance is both physical and mental, and that the slow, deliberate attention to the rhythm of life, whether in the desert on mountain passes, or within the halls of a great khan, forms the bedrock of understanding. And as night descends, and lanterns burn steadily across courtyards, reflecting on polished floors, and the faint hum of life continues in quiet corridors, Marco Polo rests, still attentive, still present, still absorbing the meticulous grace of an empire. And he carries it all inward with a calm that mirrors the meditation of his earliest journeys. Letting the grandeur of Kublai Khan's court settle like a soft, golden dust across memory and mind, he watched, he listened, he remembered. He watched, he listened, he remembered, repeating the mantra that now bridges desert and palace, endurance and observation, humility and awe, until even the mind begins to drift quietly into rest. As the sun tilts toward the horizon, spilling long amber fingers across the marble halls and silk canopies of Kublai Khan's court, we allow ourselves to pause, to inhale the quiet magnitude of what has been witnessed, to let the rhythm of corridors, the soft murmur of translators, the gentle rustle of robes, and the muted creak of distant doors settle into memory as though the very palace itself exhales in reflection. And in this pause, Marco Polo two steps back from the constant motion of audiences, envoys, and horses, allowing his body and mind to rest after the meticulous observation, the careful noting of gesture, the internal ledger of courtiers and attendants, of ceremonies and gardens, of lanterns and polished floors. For even a traveler, even a recorder of wonders, must draw a breath that is solely for themselves, a breath that does not carry messages, does not serve a court, does not tally the sequence of gestures or the alignment of banners. And in this quiet space, we can contemplate what it means for memory to be both gift and burden, for fame to arise not from power or conquest, but from stories preserved in hearts and words, stories whispered across deserts, carried over mountains, repeated in distant lands, fragile as wind-blown sand, yet enduring in the imagination of those who hear them. And as Marco gazes outward over gardens, courtyards, and the distant horizon, he recognizes the transience of his surroundings. The palace itself will age, the banners will fade, the stones will weather, and yet in his mind, these images, sensations, and impressions take on a permanence, a personal archive of wonder and attention that he alone carries, stitched together with the same rhythm he learned on the Gobi and Pamir's step, watch, breathe, step, watch, breathe. Each repetition a meditation, each observation a tether to both past and future. And we too, in the quiet of listening, can trace this rhythm, letting it pulse through our own awareness, a gentle echo of endurance and presence. For Marco Polo is not only the Venetian boy who traversed deserts and mountains, oases and courts, but also a symbol of all who venture outward into unknown landscapes and return with stories, with insights, with memories that will outlive them, fragile though they may be. And in reflecting on the delicate persistence of such memories, we can sense the impermanence of all things: the caravan that moves along dusty paths, the tents folded at dusk, the lanterns dimming in the evening, the camels kneeling beneath a pale sky. Yet we also perceive the quiet miracle of recollection, how each sight, sound, fragrance, or gesture can be folded inward, carefully preserved, and later unfolded in story, in narrative, in whispered retelling across generations, so that the vast deserts, the jagged mountains, the bustling courts, the gardens of Xanadu, and even the silence of night watch fires, all take their place, not only in memory, but in consciousness. And in contemplating this, we are reminded that the road always returns homeward, that journeys are cyclical, that what leaves the body and eyes of a traveler ultimately arrives in the minds of listeners. And thus Marco Polo becomes both real and mythic, his presence in the Silk Road tangible in sand, stone, and silk, yet ethereal in the retelling, a bridge between flesh and story, between endurance and imagination, between what was experienced and what is remembered. And as we dwell in this meditation, letting it unfold slowly, letting attention drift across the soft cadence of previous days, the groan of camels, the whisper of wind through tents, the quiet murmur of distant voices in unfamiliar tongues, we are invited to consider our own passage through spaces both real and imagined. And in doing so, we recognize that the stories we carry, the observations we treasure, the endurance we record in memory, are all part of a continuum, a gentle thread that binds the human experience across time. And we feel, as the desert gives way to mountains, as the palace fades into memory. As Marco Polo himself is reduced from flesh and presence to narrative and reflection. That all things are both ephemeral and eternal, fragile and yet enduring. And this duality is the very heart of travel and storytelling, of history and sleep, of noticing and letting go. And in the soft twilight of this meditation, we sense the quiet merging of past and present, of journey and recollection, of the world traversed and the mind that remembers it. And as we begin to step forward along the next path, moving from Marco Polo's footsteps toward the long-forgotten streets, oases and ruins of the Silk Road, we carry with us the calm knowledge that memory, like sand shifting in the wind, is never entirely lost, and that every traveler, every story, every silent witness of history leaves a trace, gentle, delicate, yet persistent. And thus we leave the palace behind, leaving Marco Polo's attentive gaze and disciplined presence to settle quietly into the annals of experience. And we step toward the next traveler, the next mystery, the next silent city swallowed by time, carrying with us the rhythm of observation, the pulse of endurance, and the awareness that while empires rise and fade, while deserts shift and mountains endure, the stories of those who passed through remain, woven into the fabric of memory, waiting to be noticed once more. And in this soft letting go, we are ready to follow the sands, the ruins, the whispers of caravans long gone, toward the lost cities of the Silk Road, toward the quiet contemplation of human endeavor, preserved in dust and stone, toward a gentle, hypnotic immersion into places both vanished and eternal, where the memory of footsteps, the echo of commerce, the trace of human life, will carry us slowly, steadily, softly into the next chapter. Across the expanse of the Silk Road, the lost cities emerge like half-forgotten dreams, each with its own distinct presence. And as we wander through them in quiet reflection, we imagine Taklamakan, oases first, where the desert seems to inhale the horizon and exhale a fine, golden haze that settles over adobe walls, low mud brick dwellings, and narrow winding streets that once carried the careful footsteps of merchants, camel tenders, and children running between market stalls, the mud-caked bricks still holding the warmth of long-past suns, their surfaces cracked and peeling, yet patterned with the faint imprint of palms and rudimentary decorative motifs, while the encroaching sands form slow drifts that curl around corners and climb along stairways that curl around corners to long-abandoned stairways to long-wanding to taverns. Its Camel would be a poking prayer to see if the word be to ill, to whispering, splippering with prelate with wixidle and with chord, but and I will to twenty bit will what about and I could walk like I eat a clot I thought I will let but about so how is that my took a boy to my store, but it's said to canvas and say more the more there more west. The remnants of stuccoed walls and tiled roofs, suggesting a blend of Chinese and Central Asian influence, flat courtyards, bordered by low walls that once sheltered artisans, scribes, and traders, with carefully aligned gates that once controlled access to temples, markets, and administrative halls. The faded colors of murals, now dulled by centuries of dust, showing stories of Buddhist monks and camels laden with silk. While the desert itself seems to intrude upon the city like a slow tide, soft sand brushing against the lower reaches of columns and doorways, catching in the cracks and hollows, and the wind carries a faint scent of resin, sand, and something like forgotten incense, drifting from niches where statues once stood, unmoving but speaking in the quiet language of absence. And then to Lulan, nestled in a more arid basin, where the architecture seems even more sparse. The city reduced to the skeleton of its former self. Mud walls caving inward, long avenues nearly swallowed by dunes, wooden beams decayed into brittle fragments, yet one can imagine the original layout, with rectangular residential compounds, narrow streets separating them, and communal courtyards where water collection basins once glimmered in the sun, the river that sustained it having receded long ago, leaving only cracked earth and intermittent pools, and the air carries a faint temps of salt and dried clay, a whisper of moisture that the city no longer receives, as if the desert keeps its treasures for itself. And finally, to Khotan, where the city sprawled near the edge of oasis. Lakes, buildings of both mud brick and stone, rising in irregular harmony-carved doorways and columns, hinting at skilled craftsmanship. Markets once overflowing with jade, silk, and fragrant spices, and the streets, now quiet, twist gently between homes and workshops, while the heat of the day causes the remaining structures to shimmer slightly, as though the stones themselves are breathing, and one can almost hear the soft, persistent murmur of water that once flowed in canals. Now dry, the sand curling along walls, pushing against thresholds, and the air, though still, carries faint memories of dust-laden trade and the chatter of countless voices in a multitude of languages, so that moving through these sites, one senses the variation in the way humans adapted to each environment. Taklamakan's isolation, Dunhuang's deliberate layout and cultural fusion, Lulan's fragility on the edge of survival, Khotan's bustling abundance, now frozen in quiet, and in each case the desert imposes itself upon human endeavor, filling spaces between buildings, flattening outlines, and softening the edges of former streets, while the light shifts slowly over the sands, highlighting the subtle differences in earth tones, ochres, burnt siennas, pale umbers, contrasting with the remains of painted stucco or colored tiles, and the horizon seems endless, stretching beyond imagination, with the occasional silhouette of a lone dune or ruined tower punctuating the view, reminding us that time here flows differently, measured not by clocks or schedules, but by the slow creep of sand, the fading of footprints, and the quiet resilience of walls that resist being entirely erased. And as you move from one city to the next, imagining the caravan tracks that once connected them, the variation of terrain becomes palpable. Flat desert expanses that stretch like molten gold, broken by salt flats or dry riverbeds, mountains rising sharply in the distance, their ridges catching the sun in pink and gray. Oases dotted with the faint glimmer of water, now reduced to patches of moisture or dry depressions. And in each setting, the urban imprint interacts with the natural landscape, the stone and mud of buildings, absorbing heat by day and releasing it at night. The wind carving slow arcs along walls, filling empty courtyards with whispering patterns of dust, and the very air seems to pulse with the memory of human activity. The merchants who once bartered over silk and jade, the children chasing stray animals, the camels kneeling in obedience, the artisans shaping clay or weaving fibers, all now suspended in quiet echoes, and moving through these cities, one becomes aware of the delicate balance between human intention and environmental inevitability. The way architecture once responded to water sources, prevailing winds, and sunlight, and the way those same buildings now yield to time and desert encroachment. While the imagination can trace the original urban planning, streets intersecting at right angles, marketplaces opening into courtyards, temples oriented toward the rising sun, defensive walls designed to protect inhabitants from raiders or sandstorms. And in the process of visualizing this, a sense of continuity emerges, linking the present observer to long-gone residents. Imagining the rhythm of daily life against the backdrop of the desert, imagining the weight of goods carried along sun-baked streets, the rhythm of water drawn and poured, of bread baked and shared, of conversations murmured in the heat of midday and the cool of evening, so that each city, though abandoned, communicates its story through the remaining forms, through the shadows cast by crumbling walls, through the texture of wind-blown sand, through the faint imprint of roads, now half-covered, and yet, despite decay, the human presence remains palpable, folded into the layers of earth, embedded in the layout of streets, in the alignment of walls, in the careful placement of buildings, to protect from wind and sun, and the variation between these cities, their architecture, their layouts, their response to water, their interaction with the environment, creates a rich tapestry for the mind to wander over. Each observation layered with time, memory, and imagination, while the desert itself remains an omnipresent character, its encroachment measured, patient, inexorable. And in tracing these ruins with thought and breath, one can feel the slow pulse of history, the quiet persistence of human adaptation, and the subtle, ever-shifting dialogue between earth, sand, and architecture, so that standing amidst these sights, one experiences not only the grandeur and fragility of human settlement, but also the enduring rhythms of nature that surround, shape, and ultimately reclaim them, leaving the observer in a calm, meditative state, tracing paths across the Silk Road in mind and imagination, noting the contrasts of form, material, and resilience, appreciating the diversity of human design in response to environment, and understanding that these lost cities, though quiet, speak with a gentle insistence, inviting reflection on time, endurance, impermanence, and the subtle poetry of life that once thrived along the edges of the desert, where sand, wind, sun, and human will intertwined to create a rhythm that continues to echo softly through the ages. As you move deeper into the lost cities of the Silk Road, allow yourself to slow and feel the landscape with all your senses, beginning with sight, where the sunlight glints upon shards of pottery scattered across one's bustling courtyards, their painted surfaces dulled but still hinting at the artistry of long-vanished hands. Mosaic tiles, once carefully arranged in geometric patterns or depicting flowing narratives, now half-buried beneath drifting sand, their colors softened into subtle ochres, muted crimsons, and pale blues, catching the light at shifting angles, as if the city itself is breathing slowly beneath the desert sky, and the walls, crumbling and pitted, cast long, delicate shadows along alleys and thresholds, offering glimpses of doorways that once opened to rooms filled with the aroma of cooking, the murmur of conversation, and the soft rustle of silk and wool. Then the soundscape begins to unfold, almost imperceptibly at first, as the soft wind threads its way through fractured corridors and broken arches, curling around the remains of columns and brushing along toppled roof beams, producing a faint, hollow sigh that carries with it imagined echoes of past lives. The chatter of merchants haggling over spices and silk, the rhythmic footsteps of camel tenders moving in step with the caravan, the distant call of children running through narrow lanes, and the occasional hollow clatter of stones settling as if the city remembers its own movements, while your ears attune to subtler whispers, the creak of sun-baked doors swinging on rusted hinges, the soft rattle of a forgotten cartwheel left to the wind, and the faint resonance of water that once trickled through now dry channels, all layered in a gentle, hypnotic cadence that mirrors the slow passage of time. And as your gaze and hearing merge, so too do the tactile and olfactory sensations, where the sun-warmed stones underfoot radiate a lingering heat that presses against your soles, the dust slipping through your fingers as you trace eroded walls, carrying a faint temps of mineral and clay, occasionally mingled with the residual scent of resin from long-decayed incense burners or the faint sweetness of dried spices that once filled market stalls, while the rough texture of crumbled bricks brushes against your palms, each fissure and grain a record of centuries, the air carrying the subtle perfume of sand, sun, and ancient smoke, so that every inhalation and exhalation seems to draw the city into your own rhythm, a quiet communion between past and present, where the lost civilizations unfold slowly before your mind's eye, their presence felt not only in form and structure, but in the delicate layering of sensations, the soft resonance of imagined voices, the warmth and roughness of enduring stone, the shifting light and color that changes with each passing moment. And in this immersive stillness, one can almost hear the pulse of the Silk Road itself, the slow movement of caravans over dunes and across plains, the creaking of camel harnesses, the occasional laugh or admonishment from a long-forgotten market stall, the gentle sigh of wind through narrow streets and broken doorways, the subtle hiss of sand cascading over tiles and cobbles. And all of this sight, sound, smell, and touch coalesces into a meditation on the impermanence and quiet persistence of human endeavor. Each sensory detail, a thread connecting you to the artisans, merchants, travelers, and families who once inhabited these spaces. The weight of their footsteps and gestures felt faintly in the air, their presence lingering like the last notes of a song that fades slowly but does not vanish entirely. And as your attention follows these patterns, you can perceive the small rhythms of daily life preserved in sensory memory, the careful stacking of goods in a corner, the arrangement of floor tiles to channel water, the slope of a threshold designed to shield a doorway from dust and wind, the indentation of doorposts worn smooth by hands passing through for generations, the warmth of sun on a wall that faces the morning, the shadowed cool of a side alley, the brittle sound of stepping on loose shards of ceramic, and the faint smell of earth and stone carried on a breath that recalls the merging of desert and city, of the human and the natural, so that each step becomes a meditation in itself, each inhalation a measure of presence, each exhalation a release into the quiet continuity of the landscape, while the imagined murmurs of past markets rise and fall like a tide. The soft negotiation over silk lengths, the gentle counting of coins, the coo of doves perched on lintels, the murmur of prayers or greetings exchanged, all overlaying the natural sounds of wind, the shifting sands, and the distant call of birds, creating a layered auditory tapestry that is never overwhelming, but soothing, hypnotic, and continuous, while the eyes continue to trace sunlit shards, half-buried mosaics, and fractured walls. Noticing the subtle variations in color, the way sand accumulates in corners, the small indentations where hands once gripped bricks or pulled ropes, the faint traces of paint still clinging to a lintel, the soft glow of light as it reflects off an oasis of tiles, the shimmer of heat rising from stones at midday, and as the tactile senses follow, fingers brushing against sun-baked stone, tracing the undulating surfaces of walls, feeling the granularity of dust, the roughness of eroded wood, the smoothness of pottery edges worn by use, the warmth of sun-heated metal or clay, all accompanied by a faint but persistent scent, dry earth, oxidized minerals, traces of smoke, lingering aromas of spices or resin. And even in the absence of human voices, the city breathes through these sensory cues, through the texture of surfaces, the play of light and shadow, the sound of wind moving unseen, the scent of centuries preserved in sand and stone, creating a fully immersive contemplative experience where the mind can wander gently among the ruins, imagining the bustling life that once animated them, feeling the tactile memory of countless hands, shaping, carrying, and arranging materials, hearing the imagined cadence of footsteps on stone and tile, smelling the faint sweetness of spices, the dryness of dust, and the subtle aroma of baked clay, all interwoven with the natural resonance of wind and shifting sand, so that the lost cities of Taklamakan, Dunhuang, and Khotan are experienced not only as architectural and historical phenomena, but as multi-sensory landscapes, living in memory and imagination, and as the listener allows these layers to wash over them, there is a sense of quiet meditation, a deepened appreciation of human resilience, environmental adaptation, and the subtle poetry of impermanence, where each sensory detail, sight, sound, smell, touch, contributes to the slow rhythm of observation, reflection, and gentle immersion, reinforcing the hypnotic cadence of the narrative and offering a calming, sleep-friendly exploration of places where time seems to fold, layers of history and environment merge, and the quiet persistence of human endeavor is felt through every grain of sand, every echo in crumbled corridors, every fragment of pottery, every fragment of pottery, every fragment of pottery, every whisper of wind, as it is slow, soft, and meditative. In the quiet, sun-bleached streets of the lost Silk Road cities, one can almost trace the invisible outlines of human life, imagining merchants bending carefully over baskets of dates, dried fruits, and vibrant silks, their hands methodically arranging wares in neat piles, measuring threads of fabric against one another, comparing colors in the soft morning light, while the faint creak of wooden carts and the rhythmic clop of camel hooves provide a subtle, hypnotic soundtrack to their labor, and nearby children barefooted and suntanned weave between pillars and broken walls, their games quiet but persistent, a rhythm of chasing and hiding, of skipping stones over sun-warmed courtyards, their laughter mingling softly with the imagined murmur of the wind, while artisans sit cross-legged on low platforms, shaping clay into jars, grinding pigments for paints, carving wood for tools or small toys, each motion repeated in meditative cadence, a quiet devotion to craft, and in a corner, a scribe hunched over a desk of weathered wood, quill scratching faint lines on parchment or thin sheets of bark, copying letters, lists, or simple teachings, pausing occasionally to dip the quill in ink, tracing the letters over and over, until they are neat and steady, every movement deliberate, every repetition reinforcing the rhythm of the city itself. A slow, living pulse that can be felt even centuries later. And perhaps nearby, a potter lifts a freshly molded amphora, runs fingers along the edges, smooths imperfections, sets it aside to dry in the warm sun, while dust swirls gently around ankles, caught in light that slants through fractured doorways, and the smell of baked clay mingles with faint traces of resin or herbs once stored within, lingering in corners where the walls have sheltered objects for decades, while a camel handler tends to his animals, stroking their coarse fur, adjusting saddles and ropes, whispering softly to calm them, their breaths forming small clouds in early morning chill, their bodies shifting weight in obedience, forming a quiet mutual understanding between human and beast. A repeated sequence of gestures, strokes, and adjustments, all part of a daily ritual that balances care with survival. And in the marketplace, a cook stirs a simmering pot over an open fire, smoke curling lazily upward, the scent of dried spices and grains filling the space, while apprentices fetch water, knead dough, or sprinkle herbs in measured motions, each gesture repeated endlessly, yet with subtle variation, a choreography of sustenance and survival. And as the mind wanders among these layered images, one can hear faint snippets of imagined conversation, the soft exchange of news or gossip, polite negotiation over the price of silk, quiet teaching moments where an elder instructs a child in counting coins or measuring flour, the gentle correction of a scribe's hand, the whispered encouragements of a camel tender to his animals, all forming a tapestry of my overlapping and intersecting, yet never urgent, never loud, merely persistent and continuous, echoing softly across the empty corridors and collapsed walls. And in this imagined world, the repeated actions, the arranging of goods, the shaping of clay, the brushing of camels' coats, the steady scratching of quillzest, a hypnotic cadence that mirrors the rhythm of the desert wind outside, the slow passage of the sun across the sky, the gradual shift of shadows along streets and alleys, so that every small gesture, every routine, every soft murmur or footstep contributes to an enduring sense of life, presence, and quiet diligence, a meditation on human persistence and domesticity amidst environmental hardship, while the listener's mind drifts across the streets and courtyards, following the repeated arcs of individuals. The scribe, leaning over his desk, fingers poised to rewrite a line, the potter lifting and turning a vessel, brushing dust from its surface, the camel handler kneeling to adjust a harness, then standing to check the horizon, the cook stirring, tasting, adding, repeating, all movements flowing in gentle, soothing rhythms. And in these imagined routines, there is both specificity and universality, each action grounded in a tangible object or material: clay, parchment, rope, food, yet reflective of broader patterns of care, attention, and endurance that define human life in these vanished cities. While occasional details, a dropped coin rolled into the dust, a spilled grain of rice, the fleeting glance of a child at sunlight on a wall, add layers of intimacy and impermanence, so that the observer senses not only the daily functions, but also the passage of time, the accumulation of small moments, the continuity of generations. And even though the voices are imagined, the cadence is real. Arrange, lift, set, write, dip, trace, stir, taste, repeat, groom, adjust, wait, a mantra-like loop that carries both memory and presence, guiding the mind gently along paths once trodden across courtyards that held life into alleys that witnessed learning, laughter, and labor. And as the listener allows these images to settle, the city as spirit unfolds not as a static ruin, but as a living rhythm of human endeavor, quiet, meditative, and full of subtle narrative arcs, where the micro-stories of the scribe, the potter, the camel handler, and countless others intersect like threads in an unseen tapestry, leaving impressions in sand, dust, and stone, a lingering echo of the ordinary, yet essential lives that wove together the commerce, culture, and quiet magic of the Silk Road, so that the listener is carried gently through centuries, absorbing the textures, sounds, scents, and repetitions of life, once vibrant in Taklamakan, Dunhuang, Lulen, Khotan, and countless smaller oases, feeling the weight of human presence without urgency or drama, and letting the imagined details of labor, teaching, play, and care become a slow, hypnotic meditation that expands awareness of ordinary human activity, deepening understanding, empathy, and the gentle, calming immersion into a world that was both extraordinary in its reach and profoundly simple in its daily motions. Along the faintly sun-washed streets of long-abandoned Silk Road towns, one can imagine the subtle, almost spectral hum of trade weaving through alleyways and open courtyards, a network of connections stretching across deserts, mountains, and river valleys, where caravans once arrived and departed with measured regularity, camels swaying beneath carefully loaded packs of silk, spices, dried fruits, precious metals, and curiosities that carried not only material wealth but ideas, beliefs, and practices between distant cities and cultures, their hooves tracing gentle rhythms across the dusty roads, creating a cadence that echoes faintly even now. Step, sway, rest. Step, sway, rest. A quiet mantra of commerce and endurance, while merchants, each speaking their own language, Persian, Chinese, Turkic, Arabic, and local dialects, move among one another with gestures, smiles, and the soft exchange of goods, occasionally pausing to adjust straps, inspect the color of silk, test the weight of coin, or taste a pinch of spice, their voices low and calm, layered over the faint murmurs of market activity and the whisper of wind through half-collapsed stalls. And in these imagined interactions, one senses the blending of cultures, artisans shaping ceramics with motifs borrowed from distant lands, weavers incorporating patterns inspired by caravans that arrived weeks before, cooks preparing meals flavored with saffron, cinnamon, or dried fruits introduced by travelers, while calligraphers, scribes, and religious teachers transcribe prayers, letters, or treaties, leaving ink traces that mingle with the dust and sunlight, faintly preserving knowledge across generations. And the caravans themselves, though long gone, can be felt as a living pulse, camels kneeling and rising in sequence, handlers adjusting packs, the rustle of cloth, the creak of wooden wheels, all moving in unison, each repetition a meditation on continuity, on coordination, on survival in challenging terrain. While small human narratives unfold in parallel, an elderly merchant counting coins, carefully recalling past travels, a young apprentice learning to recognize spices by smell and touch, a camel tender noting the temperament of his animals and adjusting routes according to their needs, and travelers pausing to share tea, water, or bread, their gestures of cooperation as essential as the movement of goods themselves. And through all of this, the Silk Road emerges, not merely as a path of commerce, but as a living conduit of ideas, faiths, artistic styles, and customs, where subtle lessons in negotiation, hospitality, and endurance were learned and passed along, quietly shaping the human experience in these borderlands. And as one allows the mind to drift among these ghostly markets, imagining banners fluttering softly in the breeze, cloth dyed with rich pigments catching light, the aroma of exotic spices mingling with sun-warmed earth, the soft clatter of coins, the low murmurs of trade, and the rhythmic sway of laden camels, the cosmopolitan character of the Silk Road comes to life, yet in a gentle, meditative way, emphasizing repetition and calm rather than urgency or spectacle, so that the listener can almost feel the slow, deliberate coordination required to keep caravans moving, merchants communicating, and towns alive, sensing the subtle harmonies created when multiple cultures intersected, borrowing and adapting from one another. And in this vision, every arrival and departure, every loading and unloading, every whispered negotiation becomes a layer in the ongoing meditation on human interconnectedness, endurance, and the quiet artistry of travel, trade, and cultural exchange, where the roads themselves, though long since abandoned, echo with the movements and intentions of countless travelers, each contributing to a living rhythm that is at once invisible, persistent, and profoundly calming. And as the mind lingers here, tracing these layered actions, it senses not only the material flows of silk, spices, and metals, but also the subtle transmission of music, stories, religious practices, language, and craftsmanship, gently carried from one place to another, weaving a tapestry of human ingenuity and cooperation that, though distant in time, still resonates as a gentle, hypnotic cadence. Step, sway, exchange. Step, sway, exchange. An enduring meditation on the quiet yet essential labor, the careful observation, and the enduring connections that defined the Silk Road's intricate network of commerce and culture, where the mundane acts of loading a pack, counting coins, or adjusting a camel's harness were inseparable from the broader flow of ideas, and where the blending of languages, customs, and traditions created spaces of learning, innovation, and adaptation, each micro-moment a reflection of a world in motion, yet moving slowly enough for the mind to rest, for the imagination to wander, and for the listener to drift alongside the rhythms of human endeavor, across deserts, mountains, and oasis towns, sensing the subtle interweaving of commerce, cooperation, and culture in a culture, and culture in a culture in a mitra, to ascent of a peepatre, of a bishant, cooror, canor to sar kabar, to hibur can, but will interview within I can I spud got of a body where you with I got the I put a you but you put to the yep but I mother but you will work us see with almost lullaby-like cadence that continues long after the last caravan has departed, leaving behind only echoes in sand, stone, and memory. In the quiet of modern excavation sites along the former arteries of the Silk Road, one can imagine the slow, deliberate rhythm of archaeologists at work, trowels scraping gently against sun-warmed earth, brushes moving in repeated, measured strokes across fragments of pottery, shards that once held rice, tea, or incense, delicate slips of manuscripts curling at the edges with age, their faded ink whispering stories from centuries past, every tool mark on stone, every groove cut in timber, every worn threshold or collapsed wall carefully noted and catalogued with meticulous precision, as if each scratch were a heartbeat of history, while the surrounding sands, ever patient and silent, shift lightly with the wind, reminding us of time's unhurried passage. And in this slow, almost meditative cadence, one senses how human activity persists even through decay, how footprints of labor, commerce, and daily life leave echoes that can still be traced in architectural foundations, in the alignment of streets, the layout of courtyards, or the subtle depressions where merchants once placed their wares. And, as archaeologists lift a fragment of tile, a portion of carved wood, or a faded textile, each object becomes a bridge to vanished lives, connecting the modern observer to artisans, traders, camel tenders, and children who once moved through these spaces. The tactile experience of holding or brushing against these remnants, echoing the gentle, repeated actions of those long gone, while the air itself carries a faint resonance of incense, spices, or baked bread, imagined through historical reconstruction. And in the repetition of brushing, cataloging, and noting, a hypnotic rhythm emerges: brush, lift, note, brush, lift, note, allowing the observer to become almost a participant in the flow of time, witnessing both the impermanence of human constructs and the endurance of memory as preserved in material form. And with each carefully unearthed artifact, there is a sense of reverent attention, a recognition that though the cities have crumbled, the desert has reclaimed streets and walls, and rivers have shifted course. The traces of human care, ingenuity, and culture endure, quietly inscribed upon clay, stone, and paper, forming a mosaic of existence that bridges centuries, a slow, continuous testament to the rhythms of life once carried along the Silk Road, where every measured movement of excavation mirrors, in its patience and repetition, the measured movements of camels and travelers, the meticulous exchanges of merchants, and the subtle interactions of diverse peoples, so that in this meditative labor of discovery, one comes to understand how the past, though silent and distant, continues to speak through objects, structures, and traces, creating a gentle, immersive experience of history that emphasizes continuity, human effort, and the enduring presence of those who shaped these landscapes. And as the mind lingers over each fragment, each mark, each careful observation, it senses not only what was lost, but also what has survived. And in this calm, layered awareness, the listener can almost hear the faint echoes of footsteps in abandoned markets, the soft calls of traders, the low rumble of camel caravans, and the whispering of wind across deserted courtyards, all converging in a hypnotic, reflective cadence that celebrates memory, labor, and the subtle persistence of culture across the vast, shifting landscapes of the Silk Road. Step, observe, imagine. Step, observe, imagine. Through the remnants of cities long swallowed by desert sands, the mind moves slowly along sun-bleached streets where once the clatter of hooves on stone, the murmur of merchants negotiating silk and spices, the laughter of children running between low courtyards, and the rhythm of daily life filled every corner, now replaced by the soft hiss of wind-shifting dust across fractured walls and collapsed roofs. And as you step carefully over broken tiles and the occasional protruding beam, noticing the way erosion has smoothed edges once sharp, the way sand has crept over thresholds and filled basins once used for washing, there emerges a gentle awareness of both the impermanence and the endurance of human endeavor. Each fragment of pottery, each carved lintel, each faded mural or tile imprint becoming a quiet testimony to lives once fully lived and intricately connected to trade, culture, and routine. And as you imagine the passage of time, weeks, years, centuries, the contrast between the past's bustling motion and the present's serene stillness deepens the air, carrying only the faint scent of dry earth and residue of spices long vanished. And yet the presence of human activity is almost palpable in the subtle depressions in the sand where carts may have passed, in the faint impressions of footsteps frozen in compacted earth, in the carefully constructed aqueducts or channels that once carried precious water across courtyards and streets, all forming a layered memory of effort and ingenuity. And as you continue your slow, hypnotic journey, the repetition of step, observe, imagine echoes in time, linking your awareness to the rhythms of those who came before, allowing a meditative reflection on impermanence. Walls crumble, markets vanish, but the essence of life, the labor and care, persists in fragments, in memory, and in the imagination. Step, observe, imagine. Step, observe, imagine, until the desert itself becomes both stage and audience, quietly absorbing the weight of centuries, turning abandonment into a serene monument, turning loss into endurance, turning each slow, mindful step into a contemplation of the human story, of civilization's fragile yet persistent imprint upon the shifting sands. And in this gentle pacing, the listener senses both the fragility of existence and the quiet, lasting resonance of human presence, repeating and layering awareness in a lullaby-like cadence that mirrors the eternal whisper of wind, the slow sway of dunes, and the enduring, meditative testimony of cities that, though gone from sight, remain alive in the touch of stone, the tilt of walls, and the soft, imagined hum of lives once carried along these Silk Road thoroughfares. You step inside the first caravanserai, its clay walls warm under the pale desert sun, and the air carries the faint scent of dust, mingling with the richer aroma of brewing tea and wood smoke. And you breathe slowly, feeling the cool shadow of the arched ceiling stretch above you, timber beams supporting it like quiet sentinels, lanterns swaying slightly, catching the light, casting soft, dancing patterns along woven mats that line the floors. And you notice how the corners are thick with settled dust, silent witnesses to countless travelers who have paused here, who have rested, who have shared whispers and meals and brief glances. And you step again into the next courtyard, larger this time, nestled at an oasis in the Taklamakan, where water trickles in a shallow channel beside the entrance, glinting like scattered silver under the sun. And you breathe again, taking in the mingled fragrances of dried spices stacked on low shelves, of leather packs and tethered camels just outside, the muffled groans and low snorts of animals blending with the quiet footfalls of other guests. And you notice the carved doors with their delicate geometric patterns, each notch telling stories of artisans long gone, each arch and alcove designed for both shelter and ceremony. And you step further into a dim hall in the Gobi, where walls of baked clay absorb heat from the day and slowly release it into the cooler evening. And you breathe, inhaling the faint trace of incense burned for blessing journeys, feeling the texture of the timber posts beneath your fingertips as you run your hand along them in passing. And you notice the repetition of shapes, the arches, the niches, the woven mats placed in careful alignment for sleeping, eating, gathering, prey, and you step into the next caravanserai, perched high in the Pamirs, where mountain winds sneak through small openings, carrying the scent of distant snow and frozen stone. And you breathe, letting the sharp freshness fill your lungs. Noticing how the architecture adapts here, heavy doors to block the cold, thick walls to hold heat, ceilings higher to prevent smoke from stoves from lingering, floors raised to avoid seepage. And you step again into a sunlit courtyard in a bustling oasis town, where merchants' voices echo softly against clay and timber. Animals shift in their resting places, and you breathe, hearing the gentle clatter of a dropped coin, the soft scrape of a sandal against the mat, the muted laughter of travelers sharing a brief respite. And you notice the continuity across all these spaces, despite differences in size, shape, and location, the repeated patterns of shelter, warmth, hospitality, care, and preparation, how each caravanserai holds the essence of the Silk Road in its walls, in its floors, in the very air. And you step slowly from room to room, inhaling the layered scents of soot, tea, dried herbs, leather, and wood, exhaling the fatigue of travel, noticing how dust motes drift in shafts of sunlight like tiny wandering spirits, how each archway frames a scene, how each mat or bench seems to remember the weight of travelers past. And you breathe, noticing the calm rhythm of human activity over centuries, the folding of rugs, the stacking of firewood, the stirring of pots, the measured steps of camels being led through the courtyard, the soft echoes carried by high ceilings, the faint, persistent hum of life continuing despite the vastness outside. And you step again, absorbing the multiplicity of experiences, the whisper of histories folded into every timber beam, every carved door, every curve of a clay wall. And you breathe, noticing that even as you move slowly from one hall to another, one courtyard to the next, one caravanserai to the next, there is a sameness, a continuity, a gentle rhythm that threads through all of them, connecting desert to mountain, oasis to steppe, past to present. And you step inside once more, you breathe once more, you notice once more, and the quiet comfort of shelter, of warmth, of human ingenuity and care settles around you like a soft mantle, and you feel the faint heartbeat of the Silk Road beneath your feet. A slow, steady pulse carried through walls, floors, beams, and lanterns, repeating itself in every structure, in every gesture, in every quiet, observing shadow, until the spaces themselves seem to breathe along with you. And you step, you breathe, you notice, over and over, until the caravanserais, in all their diversity and quiet majesty, imprint themselves gently on your mind, a network of rest and sustenance, a pattern of human endurance threaded through deserts and mountains, waiting to receive travelers, to cradle them in silence, to teach them the soft lessons of patience, attention, and care. And you step inside. You breathe, you notice, you step inside, you breathe, you notice, feeling the calm continuity of centuries, feeling the hands of countless tenders, merchants, and travelers guiding you slowly, softly, ever onward. They share small gestures, first a nod, a lifted hand, a brief smile, the kind that crosses language without words, and you observe how these simple movements carry meaning across cultures and tongues. The tired merchant offering a morsel of bread in exchange for a handful of fragrant spices, the aroma of cumin, cardamom, and saffron mingling in the warm air, mingling with the faint scent of roasted barley from a nearby pot, and you breathe slowly, noticing the subtle exchange, the quiet reciprocity, the unspoken trust in these fleeting connections, and they speak softly, a scribe murmuring notes into a leather-bound journal, ink barely drying, the scratching of quill against parchment, punctuating the otherwise gentle hum of conversation. And you observe how each word, each mark, carries memory, carries trade, carries news of distant cities and deserts yet crossed, while nearby a camel tender adjusts a stubborn pack, tightening straps and murmuring instructions to the animal, another tender offering guidance, hands brushing briefly, palm to palm, leather and calloused skin meeting, and you breathe, sensing the weight of cooperation, the rhythm of shared labor, the quiet choreography of survival and courtesy, and they share again, setting out small plates of dried fruit or roasted nuts, tea ladled from a steaming pot, the sweet steam curling in the cool evening light filtering through arched windows. And you observe the layering of human presence, the variety of dress-flowing silks, coarse wool, patched leathers, each telling a story of origin, each fabric moving gently in the soft breeze that sneaks between walls and corridors. And they speak once more, exchanging fragments of language, phrases learned from prior travels, laughter arising softly over minor misunderstandings, gestures accompanying words, hands pointing to distant mountains, two riverbeds, two caravan paths, and you breathe, noticing how the cadence of speech, the murmur of storytelling, the soft clatter of cups and mats being adjusted, forms a slow symphony of interaction, a rhythm punctuated by pauses, by glances, by the quiet recognition of another human bearing the same road-worn marks. And they observe, watching a young boy balance a small jar of tea, legs wobbling slightly, a camel shifting in response, a merchant counting coins, a scribe checking ink, noting characters from languages not his own. And you share in this observation, breathing with the slow pulse of the hall, feeling the textures, coarse mats under fingertips, warm plates resting on knees, the faint aroma of spices still lingering, the muted warmth from clay walls absorbing the sun's heat, the occasional metallic ring from tools being adjusted. And they share again a quiet conversation across a low bench, a nod to confirm a price, a whispered advice about the route ahead, a simple smile acknowledging common fatigue, and you speak along with them in imagination, joining the rhythm of communication, joining the thread that ties strangers into temporary family, and they observe again, noticing how each interaction leaves a subtle imprint, an exchanged glance, a fleeting laugh, a shared cup of water, and you breathe, noticing the continuity, the gentle layering of gestures, words, and attentions that create a calm network of connection, a living tapestry of human presence in the midst of vast desert distances. And they share, they speak, they observe, they share, they speak, they observe, over and over, until the caravanserai itself seems to pulse with these small, spatient interactions, until the walls, the mats, the lanterns, the air, all seem infused with the quiet harmony of travelers' lives, converging briefly, fading softly, leaving gentle echoes, a calm resonance, a memory of conversation, of cooperation, of cultural rhythm, threading through the stillness, through the shadowed corners, through the arches, until you, too, feel the slow, meditative cadence of human connection. Step by step, breath by breath, cup by cup, nod by nod, laughter by whisper, and you share. You speak, you observe, you share, you speak, you observe, joining in the enduring, unhurried symphony of the Silk Road's quiet heart. The feast begins quietly, the low hum of travelers mingling with the soft crackle of fire as small hands grind cumin and coriander into fragrant powders, the aroma curling upward, mingling with the scent of roasted meats and toasted nuts, and you watch as flatbreads rise slowly in the heat of clay ovens, their surfaces blistering gently, the warmth radiating into the cool evening air, while steam rises from large pots of pilaf rice grains, separating like tiny ears, pearls flecked with saffron threads, and the faint sheen of oil and the dried fruits apricots, figs. Raisins soften under a sprinkle of boiling water, their sweetness mingling with the savory scent of meats, and you breathe slowly, noticing each movement, the ladle lifting fragrant rice, the hand sprinkling nuts, the slow pour of tea from curved spouts, the rhythmic stirring of thick soups, the gentle tap of wooden spoons against clay pots, and you stir, lift, pour, stir, lift, pour, watching the repetition create a calm, meditative cadence that mirrors the long, patient rhythm of the desert road. And the travelers share plates, hands brushing briefly, murmured thanks, exchanged in many languages, the colors of clothing, silks, wools, patched leathers blending softly against the muted glow of lanterns hanging from timber beams. And you notice the textures of food, the crisp edges of flat bread, the tender flake of roasted meat, the sticky, rich sweetness of figs, the smooth, warm liquid of spiced tea held carefully in small cups, and the sounds layer, the chop of knife against wood, the swirl of ladle in pot, the faint pop of oven stones, the murmur of conversation, the occasional laugh, the soft shuffle of sandals on packed earth, and you stir, lift, pour, stir, lift, pour, feeling the hypnotic pulse of preparation and sharing, seeing how each act is both practical and ceremonial, how the hands that cook are also the hands that travel, that tend camels, that bear burdens across dunes and passes, and you breathe, sensing the warmth of ovens and fires mixing with the faint chill of desert night, the mingling scents of roasting meat, toasted nuts, fragrant spices, and steaming tea creating a gentle cocoon around the gathering. While travelers dip pieces of bread, and the motions repeat, simple and constant, stirring, lifting, pouring, passing, tasting, observing, sharing. And you notice how the ritual itself sustains the body and the spirit, a moment of calm and abundance after long, dusty journeys, a bridge between exhaustion and replenishment, between the solitary path of the camel tender and the communal warmth of travelers gathered together, and you stir, lift, pour, stir, lift, pour, over and over, until the movement becomes lullaby, until the crackle of fire and the soft swish of ladle in pot form a gentle rhythm that mirrors the pulse of distant dunes, the whisper of wind over mountains, the unhurried march of camels across sand, and you notice the tiny details, the sheen of oil on roasted nuts, the glimmer of spice, dust on rice, the curl of steam rising like smoke from incense, the soft warmth of tea in cupped hands, the quiet exchange of smiles, nods, and words across languages and cultures, and you stir, lift, pour, stir, lift, pour, letting the repetition wrap around you like the blankets of evening, like the calm enveloping the caravanserai, each movement a meditation, each taste a gentle reminder of sustenance and connection. each sound a note in the slow symphony of Silk Road life, until you are fully present in this moment, breathing with the rhythm of fire, pot, spoon, cup, and traveler, until the feast itself becomes a ritual of quiet attention, a lullaby of food, warmth, and shared humanity, stirring, lifting, pouring, stirring, lifting, pouring, and the lanterns glow softly on walls and faces, on woven mats and clay dishes. The aromas settle in your nose and throat, the flavors on your tongue, the slow, hypnotic cadence of hands and hearts moving together across tables, and you stir, lift, pour, stir, lift, pour, until the night stretches wide and calm outside, until the winds whisper over distant dunes, carrying the memory of this simple abundance, of this gentle sharing, of this meditative rhythm. And the feast continues in quiet cycles: stir, lift, pour, stir, lift, pour, a quiet, enduring celebration of survival, travel, and connection on the Silk Road. The camels shift slowly under the soft morning light, kneeling carefully onto sand, dusted with frost or warm from the rising sun, their hooves pressing into the earth with deliberate weight, and you move beside them, hands brushing over coarse fur, adjusting the straps of packs heavy with silks, spices, and pottery, listening to the low, rumbling groans and occasional snorts that mark their patience and their stubbornness, noting the rise and fall of their flanks as breaths come steady and unhurried, the leather of harnesses creaking faintly, rope fibers brushing against each other, and you speak quietly, murmuring words of reassurance, feeling the warmth of their bodies against your hands, noting calloused skin on your palms and the tightening of muscles as you lift, tighten, and secure, while the camels shift, rise, kneel again, eyes half-lidded or alert, ears flicking to the wind, tails brushing gently across haunches, and you move with the rhythm of their motion, adjusting, smoothing, checking, lifting, whispering, and the repetition becomes mantra. They kneel. You adjust. They rise. You adjust. They kneel. You adjust. And the motion loops, endless and meditative, the soft scrape of hooves against stones, the rustle of saddle blankets, the faint scent of sun-warmed hair mixing with dust and leather, the distant whisper of desert wind through dunes or scrub, all layering together to form a calm, steady pulse of labor and companionship, while you notice small details, the slight tilt of a camel's head, the way nostrils flare as it sniffs the air, the gentle tremble of lips as it chews, the quiet patience that mirrors your own endurance. And you kneel beside them to check a strap, lift a saddle, adjust a rope, speak a soft word, and feel their steady breathing against your hands, while the mantra repeats. They kneel, you adjust. They rise, you adjust. They kneel, you adjust. And the cycle folds into itself, endless and gentle, the labor itself becoming ritual, the camels both partners and teachers, their slow, deliberate presence shaping your rhythm, grounding you in the moment, teaching patience, teaching attentiveness, teaching the slow, unhurried endurance that the Silk Road demands. And as the sun rises higher, painting sands gold and shadows long, the repetition continues. They kneel. You adjust. They rise. You adjust. They kneel. You adjust. And the desert, the animals, the labor, a ritual of physical care that sustains both traveler and beast, a rhythm that will continue across dunes and passes, in wind and dust, in sun and cold, until evening falls and the camels rest. And you, too, rest beside them, feeling the shared pulse of endurance and the quiet intimacy of repeated care, the mantra echoing softly in your mind. They kneel, you adjust, over and over, gentle, calming, unbroken, a lullaby of labor and life. In the hush of the caravanserai, after a long day's march across the shifting sands and stony plains, when the air has settled into a quiet coolness and the fires burn with a steady orange pulse, there comes a time when conversation emerges not as a clamor but as a slow unfolding, like embers giving off sparks, one by one, a rhythm of speech and listening, of memory and imagination, of truth and embellishment. And it is here, in this in-between hour where the journey pauses, yet the road hums silently in everyone's bones, that storytelling becomes both nourishment and ritual, a soft weaving of voices that connect travelers who may never meet again, yet share this night, this bread, this fire, this fragile intimacy of words. He speaks, she listens, words flow. He speaks, she listens, words flow, and so the rhythm continues, each cadence of sound falling into the silence and rippling outward into the attentive dark, where camels shift in their pens and guards murmur in the distance, while within the walls the circle of firelight holds faces bright with flicker and shadow, merchants and pilgrims and soldiers and poets alike leaning forward, cups of tea or bowls of broth in their hands, listening as the currents of speech pull them into lands they have not seen, into stories that live equally in fact and in dream, into the delicate weave of human imagination stretched across the bones of experience. One man, weary from the road but eager to share, tells of Samarkand, where blue tiles gleam like pieces of heaven set into the earth. And as he speaks, the scent of baked bread seems to rise again, the bustle of markets filled with almonds and figs. And he pauses now and then to sip, to gather his thoughts, and others nod, because they too have walked those streets or longed to. And his words are like the reopening of a memory or the gift of a vision. And when his voice fades, another voice begins, softer, telling not of cities but of deserts, of mirages that shimmer in midday heat, of companions lost to thirst, whose names he speaks with reverence, as if the story itself were an act of burial and remembrance. And in this telling there is both caution and lament, and though the listeners have not walked those precise sands, they feel the dryness in their own throats, the sting of wind in their own eyes, and they nod, solemnly receiving the tale as if it were a prayer. Then a young scribe, his hands still stained faintly with ink, though the scrolls are packed away, offers a lighter note, recounting the gossip of a court far to the west, a noble who was said to fall in love with a dancer, a tale that may be true, or may be no more than rumor. Yet in the laughter that rises soft and brief, there is relief, a loosening of the heavy silence. For laughter too has its place in the night, laughter to binds the weary together. And he speaks, she listens, words flow. He speaks, she listens, words flow, the mantra of exchange, as steady as the beat of a drum. None can hear, yet all feel. A woman, older, wrapped in a shawl of faded green, recalls a song she once heard in Bukhara, a song sung by women grinding flour at dawn, its rhythm tied to the stone and the hand, to the turning and pressing, to the ordinary labor that becomes eternal through repetition. And as she murmurs a few lines, the listeners hear not only her, but also the echo of the women she recalls, as if the air within the hall briefly fills with their presence. A chorus lifted out of time, and in this way memory and imagination blur. For is she remembering, or is she summoning? And do they hear a past sound, or do they now create it anew in their own listening? The stories drift between history and myth, between what happened and what might have happened, between what is remembered and what is needed, for storytelling is not a ledger of exact truth, but a vessel carrying feeling across distance, stitching hearts together, even as the desert outside seeks to erase, to scatter, to silence. And so the travelers resist that erasure with voice, with narrative, with repetition. He speaks, she listens, words flow. He speaks, she listens, words flow. The cadence becoming as hypnotic as the march of camels, as steady as footsteps in sand, as constant as the stars above the roofless world. And within the stories there are micro moments of revelation. A boy at the edge of the circle, imagining the great cities of which he has heard, seeing them gleam in his mind, though his feet have never touched their stones. A merchant reflecting quietly on a decision made years ago, that the telling of another man's story suddenly calls forth. A pilgrim nodding slowly as a myth of a saint echoes something in her own heart. The stories do not remain contained. They ripple, they stir, they awaken. Even silence participates, for between each tale, each exchange, there is a pause, and in that pause lies the weight of contemplation, the hush in which each listener folds the tale into themselves, measuring it against their own lives, savoring it, questioning it, treasuring it, letting it transform them. However briefly, the fire burns lower, casting shadows that dance on walls rough with plaster and timber. And in those shifting shadows, the imagination sees more. One might glimpse a caravan long gone. Another might see the faces of ancestors. Another might feel the presence of unseen spirits, leaning close to listen. For stories call not only the living, but also the dead, and perhaps to the unborn. For what is remembered tonight may be told again tomorrow, and again after that, becoming part of the great chain of transmission that is the only true immortality. And so storytelling becomes a form of prayer, a meditation, a way of halting the rushing sands of impermanence, if only for a breath, if only for a heartbeat. And the repetition continues. He speaks, she listens, words flow. He speaks, she listens, words flow. Until one no longer knows where speaking ends and listening begins, until the fire itself seems to murmur, until the night itself seems to lean in, until the stories are not told but breathed, lived, shared, absolved, dissolved. And when finally voices fade and silence grows, it is not emptiness but fullness. Not the absence of words, but their settling into the soul. Letting sleep gather them, the stories remain, woven into dreams, guiding them across deserts and mountains yet to come, binding them with unseen thread, reminding them that though each step is solitary, each journey unique, they walk not alone, but in the company of countless voices that stretch across time and space, voices that continue even when the fire dies, even when the road bends, even when the tellers themselves are gone. For the story is the true traveler, the only traveler that never ceases to move. Time within the caravanserai does not pass in sudden leaps, but in long waves, slow and rhythmic, like the breathing of the earth itself. Each hour folding into the next, until the travelers feel less like they are measuring time and more like they are being carried upon its current. And to dwell here, even for a single day, is to sense that the walls themselves hold memory of countless sunrises and countless nights, the stones warm with a record of continuity, a cadence that repeats yet never feels the same. For at dawn the air carries a trembling freshness, pale light filtering in through narrow windows and high arches, touching the resting forms of men and beasts, the first stirrings of cooks tending embers, the murmured prayers rising like mist from lips cracked with yesterday's travel. And this dawn has its own silence, a ritual renewed without thought. And so the day moves, the lamps glow, the night breathes, the day moves, the lamps glow, the night breathes, the cycle whispered in every action, carried in every gesture. And as the sun ascends, flooding the courtyard with gold that soon sharpens into a white blaze, midday heat settles heavily upon the stone, driving travelers to shaded corners, to the cool promise of water jars, to the slowness of movement that the desert commands. And within this stillness are the repeated tasks that order life, the feeding of camels, their heads dipping and rising in slow unison, the sweeping of dust from mats, the washing of hands and faces at basins, or silence reigns as pilgrims cleanse themselves before prayer, the chopping of herbs, the kneading of dough, the endless stirring of pots whose steam curls upward into the hot air, carrying spices that tell of faraway lands. And each of these gestures feels both ordinary and eternal, each a thread in the larger fabric of human persistence, each a rhythm, echoing back into generations gone for what is the tending of fire or the serving of food. But a ritual older than walls, older than cities, older even than the stories told at night. And so the day moves, the lamps glow, the night breathes, the day moves, the lamps glow, the night breathes, and the repetition does not diminish but deepens, like a chant that gathers strength the longer it is spoken. When evening comes, shadows lengthen across the courtyard. Voices rise again as travelers return from brief errands or emerge from rest. And the communal meals begin, bowls and bread and cups passed hand to hand, firewood gathered and flames coaxed into life, lamps lifted onto ledges where they shimmer against plaster walls, their glow turning the harsh angles of stone into a softer embrace. And in this hour the heat releases its grip, replaced by a chill that drifts from desert sands, cooling under a sky turning violet. And here the rhythm alters yet continues, the repetition bending into gentleness, the laughter easier, the voices slower, the animals settling with a chorus of low groans, the stars emerging one by one as if summoned by the cadence itself, for above the caravanserai the heavens themselves repeat their eternal procession. And though no one counts each star, they feel the immensity of that clockwork, the deep reminder that time is not merely the sun's rise and fall, but a vast cosmic turning in which they play their small part. And so the day moves, the lamps glow, the night breathes, the day moves, the day moves, the lamps glow, the night breathes. And as full night descends, silence begins to cloak the place again, broken only by the soft shifting of sleepers, the faint clink of chains where animals are tethered, the sigh of wind against walls. And in this silence, time feels both infinite and fragile, infinite in the stars that will return tomorrow, who may not see the dawn, and yet the rituals continue, who may not see the dawn, and yet the rituals continue. For even in sleep, the pattern holds the turning of bodies upon mats, the rise and fall of breath, the guarding of doors by watchful eyes, and the slow extinguishing of lamps, one by one, their smoke curling upward to join the night. And within this repetition lies comfort, for though the road stretches endlessly, and the desert, a temporal layering that tells each traveler You are not alone. You are not lost. You are not adrift. For the day moves, the lamps glow, the night breathes, and tomorrow it will all begin again. A cycle that neither denies hardship nor erases sorrow, but offers the balm of predictability, the solace of recurrence. And in this endless folding of hours, the caravanserai becomes less a mere building than a vessel that holds time itself, a sanctuary, where human life can unfurl against the measureless expanse of desert. Tethered not by walls, but by repetition, not by stone, but by rhythm, the fire, the lamp, the breath, and so the day moves, the lamps glow, the night breathes, again and again, endlessly, until at last those who have traveled on will remember not only the walls, but the cadence, the mantra of life, as it was held within this place.